Salam, Sanbonani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of The People's Voice, produced and presented by Shabnam Palesa Mohammed for Salaamedia, your humanitarian journalism portal and a platform where we don't just tell you what's happening in the news, we tell you what you can do about it. It's Sunday, the 26th of July, 2020, and we've got another cracker of a show for you today. I want to make sure that you are able to tune in and we have a maximum amount of audience participation. So what I'm going to do is go to the Salaamedia Facebook page and I'm going to search for tonight's video and I'm going to share that as a watch party to my profile so that if you're on my profile, you're able to watch the show today. And I'm going to tell you about a number of other ways that you can join the show as well. So here we go. We start a watch party on my page and that's it. Gotta love the technology. In the first half of the show, we're in conversation with Karima Brown, and in the second half of the show, we're in conversation with Imtiaz Ahmed Kaji. But like I said, you can watch us via Facebook Live on the Salaamedia page, via the Salaamedia YouTube, the Salaamedia website, listen live, the Salaamedia or TuneIn app, and of course, all free to air decoders. How wonderful to engage with you this Sunday evening on The People's Voice. So tonight we're in conversation, like I said, with Karima Brown, who is a veteran journalist and political analyst, as well as a broadcaster and the host of The Fix on eNCA. Let's bring her onto camera and have a conversation with Karima Brown. Karima, assalamu alaikum and welcome to The People's Voice.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
An absolute pleasure and an honor. Okay, let's get straight into it because 20 minutes will fly past, as you well know. For those who don't know Karima Brown's journey in journalism, can you sketch for us a picture of your journey as a journalist?
Well, I didn't get to journalism in the traditional route, as in I didn't study journalism. I studied English and politics and history and came to journalism in a formal way quite by accident. During my youth activism days, I was involved in media so I've always had an interest in storytelling, but also using media as a tool for change. And giving people information so that they are able to change their lives. So when I moved to Johannesburg in the early 90s, just after the liberation movements were unbanned, I worked here as a researcher in Johannesburg and I did research around how faith communities were going to be dealing with the advent of a new democracy. And some of that was published in a story in the then Weekly Mail, which is now the Mail and Guardian. And an old friend now picked up the story and asked me to come on to a program as a guest. So that's kind of my introduction to formal radio at the SABC way back in the early 90s. I then joined the SABC as a producer just before the first democratic local government elections. As you know, those elections were held later than the first national and provincial general elections. And I joined as a producer, ended up working at the SABC for 9 years, left, debuted in print, left to become part of the independent stable. I became a political correspondent responsible for policy and politics, and essentially writing about the political economy. I was based in Pretoria. And then very shortly after that, about 7 months after that, I left to join Business Day. And at Business Day, I stayed for 5 years and eventually became the political editor of the newspaper. I left Business Day to become part of what was supposed to be the New Age newspaper. But I was part of the 5 editors who left on the eve of the newspaper having to be launched. Obviously, given what we now know about the Guptas, you know why we were not in a position to stay. And then so from there, I then moved and became part of a publication, an online publication called the Southern Africa Report, which was essentially a subscriber-based newsletter that gave thought pieces on the political economy of Southern Africa and South Africa. Then left to go and do a career in television, joined CNBC Africa, became the anchor of a program called Political Exchange, and launched Forbes Women Africa, which was an incredible, opportunity for me. Yeah. And then in 2013, I left Forbes and CNBC to become the group executive editor for independent media, which is, of course, the largest newspaper group in the country. I was there from 2013 to 2016, left, and then became a freelance journalist. Worked at eNCA as a analyst and also the host of The Fix, and then did a stint at 702 hosting the Karima Brown show, and of course focusing on politics. So in a nutshell, that is what I've done. Yeah.
A detailed, comprehensive, and concise nutshell, all in one. That's exactly what I would expect from Karima Brown. I find it fascinating that some of our best journalists have not studied journalism. I think that's very interesting, and it has a lot to do with our political space and ideology in our country and the activism, etc. Already a comment from Pops Ramprasad. He says, hi, comrade Karima. We've got a lot of people watching here. Mariam Bali sends us a hi. So obviously people looking forward to this conversation. Your comments and questions for Karima Brown, I'm sure you'll handle them like a pro. But let's talk about The Fix, your eNCA show. It's setting a standard in broadcast journalism already, without a doubt. What's the vision, Karima, and some of the highlight moments, highlight shows or highlight moments in The Fix?
Look, The Fix was conceptualized essentially as a program that would put you ahead of the curve. It is a program which allows me to bring my over 2 decades of experience as a political journalist to the fore, but also as an analyst. So the show is looking at current affairs in a fairly broad way, and of course also hard politics. And so essentially, if you are a decision maker in South Africa, if you are someone who makes decisions about the lives of people, you will probably at one or other time find yourself on The Fix, whether you're in business, whether you're in politics, whether in the trade unions, in the women's movement, in the youth movement, justice organizations, advocacy organizations. We interview people who make things move in South Africa. I interview people, and the idea is, of course, to, one, hold the powerful to account. And as our tagline says, we tell you what matters, how it affects you, and why you should care about it. The big so what question. So any story that comes up, the question I ask myself is, so what? Why should I care? Why would my viewers care? And once I can answer that question, then I have the focus for the show. That's the angle for the show. So essentially, The Fix is a very comprehensive, program that in an hour gives you the big issues of the day. In some instances, it's slightly ahead of the curve. It tells you what's going to happen. On a Monday morning, it is certainly the one thing that you are going to be talking about. For example, today we heard breaking news on The Fix that 2 former PRASA employees, in fact, a current employee and a past employee, were arrested. They are appearing tomorrow in the Magistrates Court in Germiston. They were caught with 2 million rand worth of assets on them. So if you didn't watch The Fix, you wouldn't know what is going to be happening tomorrow. So that is essentially what we are about. But of course, the context is bigger than just breaking news. It's about looking at how an institution like PRASA gets recalibrated, gets turned around, gets reformed to in fact serve the purpose that it was set up for initially.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I can see why it's holding the lion's share of viewership, The Fix on eNCA. But recently, Karima, based on the fact that you are a journalist who's focused on excellence, what goes with the territory sometimes is that your work is often used without being credited. And it's something that it's a massive problem, and it needs to be called out, which is exactly what you did in your social media, which I was so happy to see. And lots of people in support of you saying, Karima, say it like it is. But this shouts volumes, Karima, not only about media ethics or the lack thereof, but also misogyny and who controls the media. So what are your thoughts on this?
You know, we are in the age of aggregation, content aggregation. So people don't refer to news, they talk about content, they talk about the creation of content. And this is because we're doing this interview the way we are doing it. It's technology, it's the big disruptor. So essentially, what big algorithms do and people who curate information is they essentially scrape the barrel of whatever people put out, whether it's your social media. I mean, I saw a Facebook page post that Eusebius had put on, Eusebius Makaiser, who was a colleague and a friend, and we were discussing what is happening at the public broadcaster, and we found all our comments curated in an article in the City Press, and no one bothered to speak to us. But that's the name of the game, that's what people are doing. But in that article, we were credited for our ideas. So that curation is accurate in that it reflects that the ideas that are espoused are not the authors, but ours. But what happened last week is I had an exclusive interview with the Minister for Public Enterprises, Mr. Pravin Gordhan, and he was speaking for the very first time on what is happening at the national carrier at SAA. And the news agency Bloomberg picked the story up. And as you know, they provide news for just about everyone. And Fin24 picked it up. And both institutions, which are large, I mean, Bloomberg is an international organization. Fin Week is part of Naspers. They're the biggest multinational in the country. They ran the interview and they didn't bother saying interviewed by Karima Brown on the fix, which is all really that is necessary. And what is important is that they wouldn't have had that information had the minister not spoken to me, because he hadn't actually given a general interview. So we weren't all at a press conference where we all had access to the information. This interview was my interview exclusively. The minister has not spoken publicly before he spoke to me and subsequently, and there's been a constant set of developments. So I have taken issue with it simply because I feel it's unethical and it's unprofessional. And in most instances, it is very large organizations, mostly run by white males, who essentially take the intellectual work of a Black female journalist in South Africa. And then, of course, I got mansplained by the likes of Michael Spicer and a whole range of other people, saying that I mustn't play the race card and that I can settle the score. And I was basically asked to bring receipts for my own work. No one had interviewed Minister Pravin Gordhan, but according to Michael Spicer, I had to go and lay a complaint and I had to resolve the fact that someone stole my work. And if that doesn't explain what the male and white privilege is about, I don't know what is. But this is what we go through consistently. Imagine I was to steal Peter Bruce's interview that he'd done with Minister X, or even Paul Vacciato from Bloomberg.
You would be lynched, Karima.
I'd be lynched. I'd be called a plagiarist. Whoever employs me would be asked to sack me. And yet I was being told that I must do the legwork to prove that I wasn't being plagiarized by a white male who had absolutely no sense of irony at all at the fact that he was asking me to bring receipts. And this is, of course, very typical. And he said, I wouldn't stoop so low as to use the race card. And my retort to him was, it's only someone who's never been at the receiving end of racism that would refer to racism as the use of a cheap card. But such is life in South Africa, you know, a luta continua, the struggle continues.
The struggle continues. I mean, it's racism and it's misogyny and it's mansplaining and it's just basic lack of media ethics. And of course, we're going to see it happen again. But we have to challenge it. And so we must. We've got a couple of questions here for you. But I want to ask you one more before we go to the questions, because I know we're going to run out of time very quickly and we need to your mind. You're passionate about media freedom versus media censorship. Is it personal? Where does this come from? Where does it arise?
Look, I don't think you can be a journalist in South Africa, be my age, and not care about media freedom and media ethics. I come from a generation of people who stand on the shoulders of giants, journalists that have come before, that weren't just journalists, but that were in fact agents for change. People who are my heroes and sheroes are people like Ruth First, are people like your Agri Clusters, your Zubaida Jaffers, your Rahana Rousseaus, people who have been journalists but also activists using their journalism as an instrument for change. And for me, that is really important. I'm not in the media for the fame or for the fact that I happen to like telling stories. For me, information is a weapon in the hands of people who need to change their lives, because I believe that it's not only important to understand the world, the point is to change it, and to change it for the greater good of humanity. So my journalism is a form of activism. It is about bringing about change. It is about shining a light on the things that your mainstream media, your commercial media won't always talk about. So for me, it's important to give perspectives from workers when they are on strike, not just because we are going to be inconvenienced by the traffic, but because we need to understand why a bus driver earns what he earns and how he is supposed to take his children to school on it, or how someone says, no, just work very hard and things will come all right. And I bet you the person working at McDonald's would work 30 hours in a day if 30 hours could be squeezed in a day, and they would still not earn enough to be able to take their children to school, because the system in which we operate is a capitalist system. It depends on the exploitation of poor people. And so for me, my journalism is about shining the light, A, on the decision makers, on the policies that affects people, but two, on the conditions of poor people, so that they can speak for themselves and people can make up their own minds about whether they're satisfied with the way in which they are governed and in which they live.
100% on point. Just leading on that one, shrinking media, Karima, is a scary, scary time in which we are living in due to lockdown economics primarily, right? It poses the deathly threat to democracy and human rights. You know, from who's going to tell us the truth and what we can do about it, to media concentration, which is a juggernaut and an Orwellian nightmare for democracy and for human rights. What are your views on this crisis facing journalism, and what do you think should be the course of action?
You know, I like saying that the business model for news is broken. And it's broken because we are in the age of technology. Print is in a crisis, and the arrogance of those who own print titles do not understand the way in which innovation and technology works is partly why print is in the financial crisis that it is. We see television going the same way now with the advent of things like Netflix, where people essentially watch television on demand. So the 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock news is not the voice of authority anymore. In fact, in many instances, the 7 o'clock news is old because we've heard it the whole day. So if you're not giving people meaning at 8 o'clock in the evening, it's essentially a regurgitation of what you would have had on your Twitter feed, on your radio, on your podcast. So there's a couple of things that I want to say. Whilst the model for news as a business is broken, journalism isn't broken. News isn't broken. In fact, the world has grown more unequal. There is a desperate need for journalism. There's a desperate need for storytelling. What we need to do is to become the creators of content that is agnostic, that can live in print, that can live online, that can live in podcasts, that can live in live streaming, that can be televised, that can be put on the radio. You need to be able to develop content that can live in any platform. People aren't just satisfied to read things anymore. They want to see a picture. They're not just satisfied with a picture. They want to actually hear someone in their own voice speaking. So what you need is to be able to have sound. You're supposed to have images. You are supposed to sketch the context, background information, and that is how people are consuming news. The big thing is will the advertisers come? We all know that when we're watching something, we don't want an irritating advert. I mean, you skip basically the ad you go to. And I think that's been the conundrum. People have been struggling how to monetize. I mean, people have been putting this stuff behind paywalls. A few weeks ago, Peter Bruce, a columnist at the Sunday Times, former editor at the Business Day, my former boss, wrote a really interesting piece about paywalls, and he was demonstrating what people are prepared to pay for, and they're prepared to pay for premium articles behind paywalls. But what is really interesting is during COVID, your big news organizations like your New York Times, your Washington Post, and so on, have been making COVID-related information free, and they haven't put that information behind paywalls, unlike the Business Day, unlike the Sunday Times here at home. And that's because we're sitting with a pandemic that some are describing as a black swan event, and people are, of course, hungry for information, and they see it as part of a public education process. So there's always going to be that tension between the monetization of news and news as an essential tool to deepen democracy, to create greater freedoms. And I think that journalists are often caught in between that battle. It's a never-ending struggle. We're not going to find the answers here this evening. I'm definitely on the side of open source information, free information. And in the era of fake news, it's actually so important that one reads more than one source of information. And once you've been able to read quite a bit of different sources, you are then able to say, okay, is this true or isn't it true? And I think that is really the important issue. You must be able to tell the difference between a truth and a lie, because if you can't, then of course we sit with the makings of a failed society.
100%. We're sitting on 7:22 already. The comments are flying in, and I still want to talk about your political analysis. But let's get to some of the comments. Let's see. Pops Ramprasad says, is media doing enough to fight rampant corruption in South Africa, or are there vested interests involved?
Look, there's always vested interests involved, okay? Media organizations, if you look at a democracy like India, I mean, it's less of a democracy now if you look at the kind of fascist undertones of the Modi regime. But essentially, people use media in a place like India to position themselves in society, to be able to, wield influence. And we see increasingly in South Africa, too, people acquire media interests so that they can wage corporate and political battles through those media. We've seen with, for example, election campaigns, internal election campaigns of powerful political parties, organizations, media organizations getting behind candidates, doing the dirty work for other candidates. We've had a massive scandal around the so-called rogue unit at SARS, where you had people at the Sunday Times, running a particular agenda. So the news media isn't agenda free, because no news is free of ideology. When money is involved, when you're selling news for profit, how can you say that you are agenda free? You're going to be printing what sells, and if it bleeds, it leads. That's been the philosophy for a long time. But here's the thing, my philosophy is that quality news does sell, because people want information that will enable them to change their lives. If you take apartheid, for example, the newspapers were a chief agent of trying to keep us oppressed. They lied about troops in the township. They lied about what was really going on in the country. And yet South Africans didn't buy what was in the media. And I think there are two threats to media freedom. The one is money and basically profit maximization. And the other is the fact that people are beginning to use media as a weapon to settle political and corporate scores. And I think journalists need to begin to know the difference, because there is no such thing as objectivity. What you must be is balanced. You need to be fair and you need to be accurate. And with that, you need to provide context. My father used to love saying, if one person says, it's raining outside, and another person says the sun is shining, then your job is not to say on the one hand it's raining and on the other hand the sun is shining. You need to put your bloody hand out and see if it's wet. That is your job. Go find the truth. And that's essentially, what journalism for me is about.
Okay, comment from Firdaus Bulbulia. Citizen journalism is the way to go, but we need to ensure oversight. Naomi Matthews asks what advice you would give to a young political journalist today. Mushtaq Sheikh talks about what are some of the challenges journalists face from editors and directors of media houses with regards to content. So those were 3 questions already. Karima, do you want to comment on any one of those before we talk about your political analysis, Cap?
Okay, the big thing I think in newsrooms today is pressure, is censorship, right? So we've seen it at the SABC, we've seen it at private companies where big interest groups, whether it's political parties, whether it's businesses, whether it is, important religious organizations, wield influence and pressure, and they like to essentially boss journalists around about what they can and can't say. So, for example, often culture is used as a, pardon me, as a screen to mask prejudices. So if people don't want to talk about toxic masculinity, you'll often see them hiding behind culture. And this is not peculiar to one culture. This is across cultures in South Africa. You can be a Xhosa traditional man, you can be a Muslim man, a Hindu man. Men are often united through culture in the defense of patriarchy. So that is often a way in which journalists are controlled. When they do sensitive stories, like, for example, arranged marriages, when they talk about dowries, when they talk about circumcision, when they talk about honor killings. So those are instances where pressure is brought to bear on on the newsroom, not necessarily by politicians, but by institutions such as the big religious organizations, be they from whatever religious organization. Then, of course, there's the politics. I mean, I have been at the center of a huge battle during the last general elections, and I won my court case where the economic freedom fighters were found guilty of, apologies, of being in contravention of the electoral code, which essentially said that women journalists cannot be intimidated from doing their jobs during the period of elections. And that's precisely what the EFF did by publicizing my private information on Twitter. So bullying happens, and it's always going to happen. That's what politicians do. That's what powerful organizations do. As a young journalist, you have to make sure that when you pitch a story, you've done your research, you've got your sources, you've got your information, check your facts, triangulate your information, don't trust unnamed sources. If someone doesn't want to be named, find out why, because if the information is true, and if that person is not going to be in danger or is not going to get hurt, ask yourself, why doesn't this person want to be associated with saying this or having this view? So stay away from unnamed sources if you can, because the most important thing is to be able to back your story up, to be able to prove that what you are in fact saying is true, and to withstand the pressure, particularly from very powerful quarters, and not just political quarters at that, around trying to set the news agenda.
Absolutely agree with you. Comments flying all over the place. I'm going to need a whole hour for another show, but I'm going to combine 2 questions now, right? Let's see how we can do this. Ruling party is falling prey, ruling party members falling prey to COVID-19. You've openly expressed that the ANC needs to leadership reshuffle. I mean, it's obvious. Let's assume that they're doing this and the reshuffle includes candidates under the age of 60. What are the possible scenarios? And I'm going to combine it with this one. Would you ever consider entering politics as an independent candidate? I can give you 1 minute for that one. All right.
Okay, so
people want to know, yeah?
I think the issue around COVID is a very real issue. If you look at the composition of our cabinet, the average age of a minister in that cabinet is well over 60. We have got 2 cabinet ministers, 2 really senior cabinet ministers, the Minister of Energy and Minerals, Gwede Mantashe, in hospital, the Minister of Labour, who's overseeing the UIF, which thousands of unemployed people are relying on, also in hospital. We have the Trade and Industry Minister, Minister Patel, now also infected by COVID-19. And of course, if you look at the ANC's top 6, then it also gives you an idea of the people affected. Mr. Paul Mashatile, for example, was in isolation. He lost both his mom and his wife to illness, and one of his staff members had tested positive. We've got, according to the Sunday Times, something like 22,000 civil servants who are infected with COVID-19. And a lot of our leaders have comorbidities. They live unhealthy lifestyles. And we need to be able to talk frankly about it, because our politicians are very much a microcosm of our society. So if you look at lifestyle diseases in South Africa, you've got hypertension, you've got high blood pressure, you've got diabetes. Those are things that affects a lot of people. It affects people in my family, in your family. If you're a Black person in South Africa, you don't, you're not a stranger to those diseases, because those are diseases that are tied to the way in which we grew up and the system of inequality. And our ministers are not separate from the rest of the population. Many of them display that. Obesity is a factor in this disease. A lot of our cabinet ministers are overweight. So if they do get COVID-19, their ages count against them and their comorbidities count against them. And we've seen that that can lay anybody down. And given that, I think it is important that the governing party puts in place mechanisms that will ensure continued governance, stability in key areas. We've got 3 premiers who are COVID-19 positive. Cape Town, or rather the Western Cape and Gauteng, those are our economic powerhouses. Then we've got the Northwest, which is a mining-rich province. There, the premier is over 70 years old. He's got COVID-19. So it's a very real issue. It's not us sucking things out of our thumbs. And those are people we know of. Trust me, there are ministers that are COVID positive that have not said that they are COVID positive, because in South Africa, it's still a taboo to talk about illness and death and preparing for it. It's a conversation that South Africans really,
but we
really
love
need
having
to get
these
into.
open conversations. We love these open conversations. So what I'm going to do, because I'm now 2 minutes into the next segment, is I'm going to tag you on the comments, Karima, and I want you to talk about these 2 questions. Will you consider entering politics as an independent candidate? One, and the second one is, the year is 2025. What's Karima Brown doing, where, with who, and why? Because we all want to know. Thank you, Karima Brown, for being a voice of the people and for spending time with us today on The People's Voice.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So we've been in conversation with Karima Brown, and the next half of the show, I'm going to start a new watch party. We'll be talking to Imtiaz Ahmed Kaji. Don't go anywhere. Join the watch party or watch the Salaamedia Facebook page.